What's up, beer geeks? I'm Chris Cohen. This is Matt Shapiro.
How's
Matthew
it
Shapiro.
going?
You like the full Matthew, right?
I prefer it.
Yeah. Matthew Shapiro. We're both advanced Cicerones, and I am the founder of Beer Scholar, which is a program that teaches people to pass the Cicerone exams. So if you're like, what the heck's a Cicerone? Just basically think sommelier, but for beer. 4 levels, just like with the Somm program. We're both advanced. That's the one right before master. There's what, 27 masters now, Matthew? 28?
I think something like that. Yep.
Yeah. Um, so we're here today to talk about pairing beer and food, which I think is maybe everyone's favorite topic in beer. Like everyone shows up wanting to learn sensory analysis and how to do like evocative description. That's one of people's favorite things. Obviously, there's some mystique to like doing the sniff and figuring out what a beer is and being able to describe it evocatively. But the other thing I think people are like immediately drawn to in many cases is food and beer pairing. Um, Obviously, folks tend to think about wine when it comes to beer and food pairing, but you'll not be surprised to learn that in the beer world, the general opinion is that beer is much better for pairing with food than wine because, frankly, there's just a lot more flavors to work with in the beer world, a lot more ingredients, a lot more techniques. Um, Grain is cooked, so there's a lot more similar flavors to what you'll find in food. Um, so the thing is that food and beer pairing is really complicated. I think of it as kind of the ultimate expression of your beer knowledge, right? Everybody wants to do it right away and be good at it, but it's hard. And that's why it's not actually tested much. It's not really tested at all on the first level of the Cicerone program. At the second level, it's tested a bit. And then at the third level, you really need to know your stuff. Um, but it's complicated and it requires like very deep knowledge of beer, of how it's made, what ingredients go into it, how are they prepared, what techniques are used to make the beer. Where do you have to understand the flavor profiles of all the different main styles that are out there and where those flavors come from. You got to understand balance. You got to understand the difference between taste and flavor. There's just a lot going on. And then that's just the beer, right? You kind of got to understand a lot of that stuff about food as well. So it's complicated, but there is kind of a simple formula that is how I teach food and beer pairing at, you know, really all the levels. I think it's the best starting place. It's kind of like the outline for starting to do this stuff. Um, and then Matthew has joined Beer Scholar after going through the program himself and becoming an advanced Cicerone. He has a sort of similar method, but I don't know. He told me about it the other day. I loved it. It's similar, like I said. So I don't know. It's basically like my version, but in reverse a little bit, which I think
That's
is
right.
really a helpful way to think about pairing. Anyway, I'm just going to give my basic pairing formula, and then we'll let Matthew kind of dig into some maybe more detailed stuff and talk about his formula as well. And we'll just kind of cut each other off and jump in as desired. Sound good?
Let's do it, man.
Excellent. All right. So the basic pairing formula works like this. The first step is matching intensities. So you have a beer, you have a dish. If one of them is significantly more intense than the other, then it doesn't matter if all those flavors would have matched up great or would have contrasted each other in a lovely manner had they had similar intensity. If the intensities are too mismatched, the pairing's going to fail. That's just sort of the facts. So that's like step one is matching intensities. Do you have some? Should I just call on you to give some examples, Matthew?
Sure. Yeah, that's totally fine. So, a lot of things can contribute to different intensities. Cooking method is one. If you have food that's been deep fried, that's going to be more intense than that same food if it had been poached. If you add spices, if you add herbs, anything that contributes to a more impactful, powerful flavor is going to add intensity.
Right. So, like, I guess the most straightforward example would be like a light salad versus, I don't know, like fried chicken or a dense chocolate flourless cake, right? Flourless chocolate cake, very high intensity. Salad, very light intensity, depending on the salad, but we're talking about a light salad here. So, um, and generally, I mean, it's kind of obvious. I don't know if I even need to say it, but a lot of times when you're having a meal that's like a multi-course meal, like your intensity level kind of goes up with each dish. That's generally how it works, right? Um, Obviously, in the beer world, we've got beers of wildly different intensity levels as well, ranging from something like your light American Pilsner or lager rather, like a, Bud Light or whatever, all the way up to, barley wines, Doppelbocks, things like that. Um, just huge differences. If you pair a salad, light salad with a barley wine, the barley wine is just going to dominate it completely. It's pretty hard to think about like what flavors would have complemented each other in that pairing anyway. But even if they were perfectly complementary and perfectly contrasting in some other way and so on and so forth, it just wouldn't matter because the beer would absolutely obliterate the food. And it's similar on the other side. If you have, a flourless chocolate cake and you're pairing it with, a Schwartz beer, say, which is a very light lager, but it's a dark lager. So I'm using that as an example because, it has a little tiny touch of roastiness maybe, but it's a dark lager, so generally people have this idea like, "Oh, it's dark, it must be heavy," or something like that, but it's not. It's a very, very light lager, and if you paired that with a flourless chocolate cake, it's like, okay, you're kind of on the right track maybe in terms of, like, flavor, complementary flavors, but you're definitely not gonna have a good pairing because that beer is just gonna get completely wiped out. You're not even gonna notice it.
Totally. And I mentioned some of the things that can contribute to intensity in food. In beer, the things that can contribute intensity are things like bitterness, malt character, fermentation flavor, alcohol warming, body, hop flavor and aroma. Just things that make it more or less impactful are going to determine the intensity.
Right, right. Yeah, I think we tend to maybe think about heaviness, like body, as a primary driver of intensity, and certainly is. Um, a bigger beer in terms of mouthfeel, as we would say, kind of a fun term. A beer that has a lot of body oftentimes will also have a lot of flavor. There's just a lot more input in the beer, right? A lot more ingredients used to make it. So yes, tends to be more intense. Um, okay, that's step one. I think we did a good job with step one. Match intensities. So like if you were, say, writing a short, answer or an essay on a Cicerone exam, like you always start with step one. You have to say it. You can't just skip by it because you just think your pairing is matching in intensity. You have to say like this food and this beer match intensity if you want to go into detail. If you're at those higher levels and you're going into detail about that, great. If not, anyway, I don't want to get too into Cicerone exam stuff, but matching intensity, always the first step. So the second step is so we're getting into finding complementary flavors. So complementing, it's kind of straightforward. I think we kind of understand what that means generally. We're talking about, there's a bunch of kind of ways we describe complementary, they all kind of mean similar things like complement, resonate, harmonize, right? All pretty similar. Now, when we're talking about complementary flavors and aromas, I am saying flavors and aromas very specifically as opposed to taste, right? There's the five basic tastes. We're going to talk about those later. When we're talking about complementary, so we're in this section now at step two. We're entering this. There's only four steps. We did intensity. The next are the three C's. And the first one is complementary. And we're working with aromas and flavors. So we're talking about anything you can smell or taste, but not those primary tastes, not sour, sweet, bitter, umami, or what did I miss?
Salty.
Salty. Um, we're talking about aromas and flavors. So pretty straightforward, right? What is the sort of flavor or aroma bridge between these two, between the food item and the beer? We want generally there to be some kind of matching or complementary flavor and aroma. So the simplest version of that, of course, is like matchy matchy. Like I've got, I don't know, a flourless chocolate cake and a dark beer that has like chocolatey flavors and aromas, right? That's like very obviously matchy matchy. It it harmonizes, it complements, or just straight up matches. Um, but there's all kinds of other flavors and aromas we know go well together, um, that you could say harmonize or complement, even though they're not like matchy matchy. Like for instance, if you do have a flourless chocolate cake, what do you serve it with? You don't usually serve that on the plate by itself because that's kind of boring. I mean, I've not that I've never been served a flourless chocolate cake like pretty much by itself, but a lot of times you'll see a restaurant, or if you're a cook or baker, you might put like some kind of like fruity stuff with it, maybe just straight up fruit, maybe some kind of syrup. Um, I think that's kind of the most common thing you would put on a flourless chocolate cake. And so we know that those flavors go well together, right? They're not matchy matchy, but they definitely harmonize, they definitely complement each other. And so when you think about a dish, like most dishes aren't a single item, right? They're a combination of things. So there's already a bunch of pairing going on even with a single dish in a way. So you can always like think about that, almost deconstruct it a little bit and say like, how do I replace some of those things with like a beer? So maybe if I'm serving a flourless chocolate cake and I want to do something that, serve it with something that will complement it really, really well, I'll look for like a big fruited beer that'll kind of replace that fruit compote or whatever would have come on top of it. So like those Lindemans lambics, those fruited lambics from Lindemans, right? They don't always get a ton of love in the beer scene because they're not traditional, because they're like back sweetened. But that back sweetening actually brings them up in intensity to a level where you can serve them with a flourless chocolate cake, and they replace that like fruit compote. So they bring this like very complementary and harmonizing flavor to the dish, which almost like replaces something the dish might have been served with anyway. So that's kind of, I think I use that. That's like one of my secret weapons in tastings when I do tastings for beer people and non-beer people. Um, because I think it can be kind of revelatory because people don't always think of those Lindemans fruited lambics as like fancy, right? You can get them at Safeway, but like they're amazing for pairing, specifically with big chocolatey dense desserts. Um, yeah, what do you think? What do you think, Matthew?
I think that's a good way to think about it. Replacing an element of the dish that might be missing is a good way of thinking about complementing. As Chris mentioned before, you have this cooked element, this malted barley. So another good way to think of it is, what are the bready notes you're getting from the dish? What kind of beer can you pick that has similar bready notes? Do you want something a little darker, like a doppelbock that might have some pumpernickel bread notes, or are you want something a little bit lighter, maybe like a Munich Helles if you're having something a little more subtle or lower in intensity in the dish.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that goes back to something I mentioned in the beginning, which is just with beer, you have a huge palette of flavors and aromas to work with in a way that you do not have with wine. I think that's just kind of a fact. Um, there are these sort of famous stories in the beer world of like somms and beer experts kind of having these dinners where each picks a one wine and one beer for each dish that's served throughout this dinner, where it's kind of like this battle, like what pairs best, the wine or the beer? And beer seems like it's the dominating drink for this.
Definitely seems like a wider palette to paint with.
Yeah, right,
Different levels of intensity, different basic tastes, tons of different flavors, different textures. There's just a bigger palette, I would say, with the choices you can get with beer.
right, right. Yeah. Um, I'm just seeing here if I got a good example for like a Dunkel's Weiss beer. I feel like that's a really good one for pairing. It has all kinds of spicy character and fruity character. I mean, the example I used was like, think about what a dish might be made with and replace a piece. But obviously, you don't have to do that. You just have to think of a beer, think of like what a beer is bringing to the table in terms of aroma and flavor, what the dish is bringing to the table in terms of flavor and aroma, and find some kind of bridge, right? It can be matchy matchy, or it can be just things that go well together because they're served together all the time, right? Um, let's see. All right. I think we can move on. Let's move on to step 3. So step 1, match intensity. Step 2, find complementary flavors and aromas. So step 3, I think is actually where the greatest pairings are made. And it's also the most difficult step. It is finding contrast, right? Difficult. How do we find contrast that works? Um, the simplest way to work with contrast, in my opinion, is to work with the basic tastes, which we just said. Salty, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, right? Tastes are really what is the key to balance, right? Like beer itself, pretty much all food, all beer, they're already made with some kind of contrast involved, right? Otherwise, they just fatigue your palate. So, like beer, for instance, almost always is a balance, and balance is almost another word for contrast, right? These are two things that
Totally.
are kind of opposed to each other that are keeping each other in balance. And so with beer, it's usually hop bitterness and malt sweetness that are balanced in the beer according to, however the brewer made the beer. And different styles have different balances. Some people like bitter beer, obviously in the United States and like to the general kind of global craft beer scene, like bitter beers and IPAs have been super dominant for quite a while. But there's a ton of more malt focused beers out there that are, not sweet, but they're not bitter. Most beers, kind of balance out somewhere in the middle. Um, it makes them, I think, pleasant to drink, easier to have in I guess quantity. Not that we're going for like drunken quantity, but I'm just saying like, when you have a double IPA, like you're blowing your palate out pretty badly and like how many of those can you have before you're kind of fatigued? Um I guess I've met a lot of people who would argue you could have many of those before you're fatigued, but whatever. Anyway, contrast. Back to contrast. So finding contrast between beer and food, kind of difficult. Complementing is just like you just understand it. It's simple. But contrast I think is more complicated. So, I think the very best pairings though are kind of like reliant on a lot of contrast. Matchy matchy and complementary flavors like kind of easy to find. That's not super challenging. finding really good contrasting pairings much more difficult. So to go back to my chocolate cake example, the flourless chocolate cake. This wasn't planned either. No, it's just I just think that that is an easy. It's actually kind of an easy example. So you've got the flourless chocolate cake. It's pretty dense and heavy. They're usually not super sweet, right? They're made with like bittersweet chocolate, but they're sweet. They lean sweet for sure, not overly so compared to some desserts. But that beer that I was talking about, the Lindemans like fruited lambics, they're back sweetened, so they have plenty of sweetness. That's actually a bit of a flavor bridge. It also like brings up its intensity, so that all works. But where's the contrast? The contrast for that one is, well, that beer isn't like most beers. Most beers are balanced by bitterness to sweetness, right? But that beer is actually a sour ale, so it's balanced with like acidity and sourness with sweetness. And so when you pair that with this flourless chocolate cake, which has no sourness going on, that would be very weird if you were served like a sour chocolate cake, right? But we all know when you're eating like a flourless chocolate cake, it sort of like fatigues your palate pretty quickly. It's heavy, it's sweet. You take a few bites. If you don't have some kind of contrasting element to it, you're basically like it all starts tasting the same and your palate's kind of like worn out. You only want a few bites before you're done. If you introduce this sour ale with all this like sour acidity, it actually serves to contrast that sweetness in such a way that it makes the dish much better, I think. Um, it can even make some of the flavors pop, some of those other flavors pop by comparison. So when we're saying contrast, again, it's kind of similar to balance. Like the terms can be almost interchangeable in a way. So you're balancing the sweetness of that cake with this sourness.
Oh, I
So
think that makes a lot of sense. A way that I like to think about contrast is if you have like a real fatty taco and you squeeze lime over it, and that just creates the perfect bite. That's the contrast that we're talking about. Or if you have a super sweet dessert, then you sprinkle some salt on it. You have the sweet and salty. These kind of things that we know, like sweet and sour, all of these contrasting things we experience in food itself. When you can have beer be a part of that equation, it's something that becomes greater than the sum of its parts. When it's enjoyed together, it creates this third better thing.
yeah, that's a really good way to think of it. And I think that it feels complicating to me to talk about how like the food and the beer themselves are this whole like series of complementary and also contrasting flavors, right? On both sides. But in a way, it does give you the if you think about it that way, it does give you the tools to kind of like pick all that apart and understand like in the way that you just said that like adding beer to it is really just another element of all of this kind of wide range of complexity, right? But this is why I'm saying like it is complex to do food and beer pairing. And as we sit here and we maybe name all these sort of examples of pairings, um, they're all like theoretical, right? I mean, Matthew and I have tried these, so it's not like totally theoretical. But whenever, say, we are teaching a class, which we do weekly for our students, taste it, where we taste a beer together and break it down and describe it. We sometimes end those classes with a beer pairing exercise, and it's all theoretical. And people come up with these ideas, and we're like, yeah, that sounds good. But when it comes down to it, every style of beer has like a whole bunch of different examples. You can prep a certain dish. I mean, I can say flourless chocolate cake, but you can make it in like however many different ways with all this variety of ingredients. So, the ultimate like mind-blowing, game-changing pairing that's gonna like make people freak out because they love it so much is is something that has to be tested and dialed in. We can come up with these theoretical ideas for pairings and then go try them and like they may work, they may not work. You may need to pick a different brand of whatever beer style you were going to pair, or change the way you make that dish for it to all work perfectly. Anyway, it is complex in that manner. Um, but yeah, I do think that with contrast, which I feel like is the most complicated of the steps and the most difficult of the three C's. Um, I think you're right on, Matthew, with the acidity addition, right? That is kind of the easiest way to approach it, right? That's what I did when I was talking about the flourless chocolate cake. That's what you're doing when you're talking about the fattiness of the tacos, which is basically like umami. You're talking about like
Some savoriness.
savory umami and kind of balancing that out with some acidity, some sourness. Salad dressing is like that for salads. A lot of dishes have that.
Totally. And with beer, we have bitterness too. And bitterness is something that can really contrast well with something that's fatty. You have something that's sort of overwhelming and fatty, and you're like, man, I wish I had something to sort of refresh this. Bitterness can be a really nice contrast to that. And that's something that we have as beer nerds that those wine folks don't really get to play with.
That's true. Another thing that's really important, I think, to talk about if we're going to talk about bitterness in pairing and contrast, in particular, the contrast step, is that generally speaking, as a rule, it is much harder to pair with bitter beers than it is to pair with balanced beers or beers that lean slightly sweet. That said, all beers are made with these ingredients, right? I mean, sour beers aside, all beers have bitterness. Even a beer that's really evenly balanced or even maybe leans slightly sweet, it still has a bunch of hot bitterness in it that you can utilize for this contrast. People tend to think like in this big picture way that like, well, if that beer is balanced evenly, then I can't really utilize the bitterness as like the contrasting agent. But that's not true.
Totally agree.
It's just something you have to play with and get to know and learn. But that is a fact. There's bitterness in all beer, and you can work with it. The beer doesn't have to be itself balanced bitter. All right. I think we beat contrast down pretty good. So step one, match intensity. Step two, find complementary aromas and flavors. Step three, find contrasting tastes. You can find other kinds of contrast, but it gets complicated. So let's stick with taste. And then you've got step four, which is the third C, and that one is cutting. So cutting is essentially a mouthfeel thing, right? Now we're kind of getting away from flavors, aromas, and um, contrast. Although there's like a little bit of overlap between, I would say, contrast and cutting. I warned you that this was complicated. So cutting is like, how do I refresh my palate, right, after a bite of food? There's some really straightforward stuff that all beer kind of has that makes it great for cutting, and it's another one of the reasons actually that beer is considered by many to be superior to wine for pairing with food and beer. Um, the one thing that pretty much all beer has that wine generally does not have is carbonation. So that is really effective at cutting, at refreshing the palate. And even low carbonation beers, like an English cask ale, has plenty of carbonation to do lots of cutting. So carbonation is key for cutting. Other things that do lots of cutting, sourness in beer will do that, and you don't have to have like a sour ale for that. It can be all beer is acidic. So there's, a sour ale will do lots of cutting, but a lot of beers have plenty of acidity for that. Um, Beers that are highly attenuated and dry, drier beers like a saison or something like that, that does a lot of cutting. Bitterness does lots of cutting. Let's see, what else? Beers with lots of alcohol, beers that are boozy. I would say on the wine side, that's kind of what they rely on for cutting is just alcohol. Um, Obviously, most beer doesn't have the same kind of alcohol levels as wine. Some do, but not most. But for boozier beers where you can really detect the alcohol, that will do some cutting. And then roastiness. So if you have like a stout with like those like kind of burnt flavors, that actually will contribute some cutting. Um, and the reason cutting is important again is to refresh the palate. Like, let's go back to the chocolate cake example. Um, that will fatigue your palate pretty significantly if you're just eating the chocolate cake with, I don't know, some water or just no drink at all. But you have that sour Lindemans back sweetened fruited lambic, and it's like, okay, so now we've got like a really high carbonation beer, so that's doing a ton of cutting. It's also very acidic. It's a sour ale. Instead of being balanced with bitter hops, it's mostly a balance of acidity and sourness. So that's going to do tons of cutting and refresh your palate. Now, we also talked about that when we were talking about contrast. So that's where there's a little bit of overlap where these things can get kind of complicated and like sometimes a little bit of that contrast can actually also serve as a cutting, element. Um, but you have to understand the difference is that with contrast, we were talking about tastes, and with cutting, we're talking about mouthfeel, which is physical sensations, not taste.
Yeah, I think
But
for your chocolate cake, the first thing that came to mind was if you were to have an imperial stout with some alcohol warming, kind of like calm the intense sweetness that is coming from the chocolate cake. And it goes both ways. You get this intense warming that you're getting from the beer that can be pretty bold. Then you take a bite of the chocolate cake, you're getting that sweetness, kind of calms that down. So it's this nice little refreshing aspect that each lend each other.
yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think I've been talking about this mostly from like the side of the beer pairing coming in and affecting the food. But no, that's a really good way to think about it is like, yeah, also the food is having an effect on how you experience the beer. Like when I drink a sour beer, like they're often also fatiguing because they're so sour and I don't want to drink a whole bunch of those, but pair it with something that is kind of dense and balances that out and contrasted and also kind of, I mean, it doesn't do cutting or something, but yeah, just contrast it in a way that makes the whole experience more pleasant. Um, yeah, so cutting, really important. It's the fourth step. So if you're, again, writing an essay about this, like you gotta hit every one of these steps very specifically. What do you have anything to add to cutting, Matthew?
Let's see here.
There are like some more advanced uh pairing, interactions, but I don't think we need to get into those.
Yeah, I don't think we need to get too deep into that. I think that the main takeaway from cutting is similar to contrast and this balancing thing. You just don't want to have sweet on sweet on sweet or bitter on bitter on bitter. You really just want to have it to where each bite of food makes you want to take a sip of the beer, and after a sip of the beer, it makes you want to go back to the food where it's just this nice flow of things that go really well together and nothing's overpowering. It's sort of a little dance between the two.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. And you saying sweet on sweet on sweet made me think of something that I think is a real important point to mention, which is to go back to step 2 when you're talking about the complementary stuff. Um, there is this idea sometimes it seems intuitive, which is like, oh, well, if I have a food that's kind of sweet and I pair it with a beer that kind of leans sweet and it's balanced, it's just going to compound and compound and it's going to become overly whatever. And you actually really need to test these things out to understand if that's true. It often isn't. Like, for instance, to go back to the chocolate cake example, the your intuition might be that like, well, it'll it'll pair, a flourless chocolate cake will pair great with a traditional sort of goose or fruited lambic that is very, very dry and very, very fruity and sour, because you'll just get like maximum contrast. And they're both pretty intense. But actually, when you try that pairing, you'll see that it fails. And the reason that those like Lindemann's back sweetened fruited lambics work with that pairing is because of all that extra sweetness that they have actually kind of raises the intensity up and creates like this taste bridge or flavor bridge with the sweetness, and it doesn't actually compound to the point where you're like, oh, this is actually becoming unpleasantly sweet. um so yeah, that's why these things have to be tried in real life. They're all theoretical until you test them out. So, okay, that's my pairing formula. My pairing formula is match intensity, find complementary flavors and aromas. Step 3, find contrast. Step 4, cutting. And that is kind of like the the way I think this is done, that is simplest. I've been teaching it that way for a decade, I think, at this point. Um Trying to think when I released my first beer scholar study material for these exams back in like 2014 or something, so more than a decade. But then you had like this reverse version of it that I thought was really cool, Matthew.
Thanks. Yeah, it's essentially the same guidelines as you just laid out, but for me, it's just an easier way to set yourself up with an outline to more easily come up with a certain food or drink, depending. So, if you are studying for the Cicerone exam or taking a Cicerone exam, do what Chris said. On this essay, you need to state the intensity first, and you need to match intensities, and then you need to talk about the three C's. Um, my method is what I like to do in the day to day,
Yeah.
and
The
it's similar. And
My guess is
oh,
we'll have real life normal people watching.
right. So if you aren't using this to prep for an essay, this is what works for me. I like to start with the three C's. So I like to think about. I have this beer in front of me. Which elements of the three C's does the beer possess? So cutting. What cutting power does the beer have? Complementing. What flavors and aroma are in the beer? And then contrast. We're looking for those opposing tastes, like sweet and sour, sweet and salty. So, what are the major tastes in the beer? So, for example, if we're working with a Belgian double, we're looking for the three C's in a Belgian double. Cut. What are the cutting elements? In a Belgian double, I would say higher carbonation and alcohol warmth are the cutting elements. So, gonna write those down. Complementing aromas and flavors we're looking for that are going to be matching in the food and the beer. So, what are the aromas and flavors that you're getting from the beer? With Belgian Double, I think it's a really yeast forward beer, but also some good malt character. So, things like toffee, molasses, oranges, plums, raisins, clove, allspice, mint, tarragon, Maillard browning. All of these things are things that we can consider looking for in the dish. And then contrast. We're looking for the major tastes that are going to be contrasting in the beer and the dish. So the main taste that I think we're going to be working with Belgian Double, I would say, is the sweetness. This beer leans a little bit towards sweetness rather than bitterness. So we're going to use the information to help us identify the elements in the dish that we're going to be looking for to allow the three C's to shine. So, cutting, we have carbonation and alcohol warmth in the beer, and those are going to cut fat and sweetness. Those are the interactions. So, we need a dish with fat and or sweetness to work with this alcohol warmth and carbonation in the beer. And for complementing, we need a dish with some similar flavors and aromas that we just discussed in the beer. So that Maillard browning, the clove, the plum. And for contrast, we need to find a dish with acidity, bitterness, or some salt to contrast that sweetness in the beer. So instead of starting with the intensities, I'm sort of outlining the elements that we're going to be looking for in the food to pair with this Belgian double that we have. So that's my first step. And then I like to go to intensity second after I've sort of written down all the things that I'm looking for in the food. And intensity is critical to a successful pairing. So this is very, very important. And it's also important to note that it's a subjective measure. I think that folks can agree that generally this is high intensity, low, medium, but it's subjective. Everyone is from a different culture. Everyone has different preferences or different tolerances. But I usually like to work with low, medium high, or high. But it's up to you to determine what kind of measure you like. So, um, working with our example of a Belgian double, we have lots of fermentation flavors. Esters are the fruity compounds that come from yeast, and phenols are these spicy um, elements that you get from yeast. Not spicy like capsaicin heat, but the clove and the allspice. So we have fermentation flavors. We have really high carbonation. We have kind of medium alcohol warmth. We have maybe some spices that could be used. We have bold malt presence and even some residual sweetness. So, all of these elements together, for me, I'm going to call that medium high. What do you think, Chris? Do you think Belgian double, medium high intensity
Yeah.
generally? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a relatively big beer. Just when you look at all this many beer styles out there, something like a Belgian double had like significant flavor, just pretty punchy flavors. Um, it is pretty boozy, right? Um, it's it is a relatively dry beer, right? So it's boozy but not heavy. But I think taken as a whole, yeah, it's definitely medium high. You know, it's a punchy beer. A lot of the Belgian ales are, right? They're going for big flavor. They're thinking of it and, culturally they think of these beers as like food and for pairing. They have like a cuisine de beer kind of attitude toward beer. Um, that's very different than sort of the maybe like old school American beer for the masses kind of flavorless vibe.
Yeah, a ton going on. So, all of those elements together create this thing that's medium high intensity. That's what I'll call it. And just to give some other examples of how you'd pick out intensity for other types of beers. So, a Munich Helles is usually a beer with low intensity. So, lower bitterness, restrained malt character, a really low or no fermentation flavors. So, no fruity esters, no spicy phenols, a lighter body. There's no alcohol warming, moderate carbonation, low residual sweetness. So all of these elements together um, create something with a low intensity. And it doesn't mean low means bad. It just means low intensity is what you're going to be looking to match in your food element.
Mm.
So that's low intensity. And high intensity would be something like an American barley wine. So super high bitterness, a high expression of hop flavor and aroma, high levels of sweetness, bold malt, heavier body, medium high alcohol warmth, lots of residual sweetness. So just all of those elements create something that's really intense. And again, not good or bad, but that's a beer you could pair with a really intense dish. But Belgian double, we're going to go with medium high. So next, we're going to use the three C's and intensity to determine what we think a good dish would be. So in part one, we determined that we need an element of fat or sweetness in the dish that the carbonation and alcohol warmth can cut. We need some similar or complementing flavors and aromas as our double. So something with the tarragon, pepper, Maillard browning, plums, raisins, any of the elements that is in the beer. And we need an element of acidity, bitterness, or salt to contrast the sweetness in the beer. So, kind of just working backwards, I'm saying, here's all the stuff in the beer, and here's the missing elements that we need to balance this beer that we're going to be looking for in the dish. So, all of those elements, and then we also need to find a dish that has medium high intensity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the difference between our approaches or like how I teach it versus your sort of just everyday version of doing this is a subtle difference. But, mine really starts from this formula that marches you step by step in one direction, and you kinda just start with the actual dish and the beer and then work backwards, and I had just never heard anybody describe it to me that way, and so when you told me about it, it struck me as, like, really interesting and kind of innovative, so
Thanks, man. Yeah, I have so kind of in summary of all that, um, I have a couple like an example that I came up with. So
yeah, you
just to
gotta have
sort
some
of
actual pairings to end with.
right, yeah, yeah, to back this up, see if it works. So just to summarize, so the elements we're looking for in the dish to go with the Belgian double, we're looking for at least one of each of these elements, but more may improve the pairing. So we're looking for something with fat or sweetness, similar flavors and aromas as the double, acidity, bitterness, or salt, and medium high intensity. So, I ran down all this stuff, but really that's the meat of what we're working with. And what I find with this sort of working backwards approach is that when you have these categories of things that you're looking for, it just helps you narrow it down a little bit better. Because I think sometimes when you're thinking, okay, cutting it could be this, 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 or this, but here it's like fat or sweetness. I need something with fat or sweetness.
Mhm.
I think that it just helps to narrow it down. So the pairing example that I came up with was pairing this Belgian double with fish and chips, some malt vinegar, and a side of mushy peas made with a little bit of mint. And I'll tell you why. So for cutting, carbonation cuts the fat from the fried batter in the fish. Complementing, we have mint in the mushy peas, which complements the yeast or spices if they're using it in the double. The malt vinegar complements the malted barley in the beer. The fried batter complements the mired browning notes from the malt and the candy sugar. Contrast. Sweetness from the beer contrasts the acidic malt vinegar and the salty chips. And then we're considering the intensities. Do the intensities match? I would say yes. Deep frying the fish, adding herbs to the peas, and using the highly acidic malt vinegar creates a dish that's medium high intensity. Um, and like Chris was saying, it's pretty critical to try the pairing because all of this is theory. I came up with on paper these rules that I think would create a great pairing according to these guidelines that make up basic food and beer pairing theory. But
Yep.
there are ways to fine tune it as well. So let's say you need to adjust the dish to match the intensity. I have this deep fried fish. I have these mushy peas with mint. Let's say that the beer is just getting overshadowed by all of this stuff. And we need to tweak it. We don't need to rewrite the entire pairing. We can make some small tweaks. So something like instead of frying the fish, we could prepare it a different way. We could poach the fish. We could bake it. We could serve it with a baked potato instead of frying the potatoes. We could even serve it without the mushy peas. Take away an element of intensity. And then let's say that this beer is just so crazy intense and we need to amp up the dish. We don't need to pick a brand new dish. We can add on a little side of creamy tartar sauce. We could throw some spicy ketchup on there for the fish. We could prepare the mushy peas with some additional herbs or spices or more heavy cream to bring up the intensity. So there's lots of ways to tweak it without having to go totally back to the drawing board. And from personal experience, sometimes, like Chris mentioned earlier, just picking a different producer of the same type of beer can make a big difference because you could try this and take a sip and be like, whoa, this is much more bitter than I expected this Belgian double to be. I didn't really think that the bitterness would chime through. But if you try it from a might find that it drives a lot better.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you gotta taste it. You gotta taste it.
Yeah, you gotta actually do the pairing to find out if it's gonna work.
Yeah, and go for tweaks. If you really think it's gonna work and it wasn't magic, I mean, condiments and garnishes or taking them away are a really good way of fine tuning, substituting ingredients. So let's say the beer was pretty bitter and it's creating a weird metallic effect with this fish. Maybe try a different fish. Maybe try a different protein. There's lots of ways to zhuzh it up and to make some changes. But it's just pretty critical to try. A lot of things will surprise you when you're doing food and beer pairing, good or bad surprises. I've had them all. And really, what we're looking for things that become greater than the sum of its parts. I think it's totally fair to have a beer that serves as a refresher that maybe doesn't match in intensity, like, I don't know, pizza and a light lager. There isn't a whole lot of magic there happening, but, they drive well together, and that's totally fine. But this sort of bigger concept that Chris and I are talking about is you're trying to create something that's magic.
Right. Yeah, if you can, I guess as a longtime beer nerd, as someone who's done all the Cicerone training, I think I just feel like part of my job writ large is to A, do no gatekeeping whatsoever. Like the whole idea is to bring great beer to the people, make people help people appreciate beer. Um, and one of the ways that you can do that, sort of bring people into the scene or at least make them appreciate it in ways that they may not have before, or even just change their mind about it. Sometimes you often have people who are just like, yeah, I don't really like, I'm not into beer. Um, Create like a transcendent pairing experience for them and you can change their minds.
It's totally true. Have you ever done that, Chris? I know I have a couple of dishes that I've made with some folks who aren't beer people, and they were pretty stoked. Like, whoa, like maybe I do like beer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's sort of uh, I think beer people know that like if you have someone who's like, I don't really like beer, I kind of like wine, and they're like, I've never had a sour ale, right? Like you can give them a sour beer, and they might be like, wow. I mean, depending which one you give them, obviously, they might be like, holy crap, I didn't even know beer could be like that at all, and it tickles like a spot for them that is sort of like maybe similar to why they like wine more than beer, or so they thought. Um, a lot of people have it's like taken that chance where they've gone to a store and they've bought some beer that sucked. And they're like, I'm not gonna take that chance over and over again to like learn what I like. Right. Like when I go to the wine aisle at the store, I mean, I probably know a little bit more about wine than the average person because I'm just like into booze. But like generally speaking, I mean, it's like, I feel like Neo in The Matrix when he's like, "We need guns, lots of guns," and it's just like a bunch of shit that looks the same in this aisle, and I don't know the difference between all these different bottles of wine. There's just aisles and aisles and aisles of options, and I don't really know what all these things are, or what grapes they're made with, or what their flavor profiles are. I think with beer, you have at least a fighting chance because, like, we all know what an IPA is and a pale ale, and the labels, I think, tell you, or the names of the beers tend to tell you more about what flavors you're going to be getting. Um, but I do see it as my job to sort of like try to bring people into the fold, give them a great experience around beer, be welcoming. And I do think that when you're trying to do that, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? There are like classic pairings that are great that we know are amazing. And so, for instance, like many people do not like barley wine, right? I mean, if you just give a random person who's not into beer and like an English barley wine and say, try this, they're usually going to be like, Jesus Christ, that's heavy. It's just like heavy. It's kind of syrupy. I don't, it's not really my jam. Um, put together a cheese board and make them have them try the like a good blue cheese with a barley wine, which is a classic pairing known to be one of the best, most transcendent pairings that is easily available. And you can change their mind by introducing it in this different way.
That's totally true. I had a similar experience. I hosted a tasting, and I pulled out a Flanders Red, which could be a lot for someone who maybe doesn't drink or doesn't drink beer. It's
Yep.
highly acidic. There's some
Sour,
acetic character. It's
vinegary.
sour. It's even a bit sweet. There's a lot going on, and it can be kind of intimidating to try that. But if you give them a bar of chocolate and some salty pretzels, you say munch on this and then try the beer.
Mhm.
It's like, whoa, like this is pretty awesome together. I see like the sweet and salty, the sour with the chocolate. And it allows the beer to shine in a way that's not very intimidating because it's something that they're already accustomed to. You know, they like sweet and sour, sweet and salty. So when you give them these things, it just makes it more approachable and it's easier to try something for the first time in a way that's more familiar than it is to go down this aisle at the beer store and just sort of like grab something and say, is this for me or not?
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, in the same way, it is a Som's job to make like selecting and having a fancy bottle of wine a special moment, a special occasion. That is kind of what we can do for folks. Obviously, when I just go down to the bar and have some beers, I'm not thinking this way. But like, you know, if I'm hosting an event or I have people over for dinner, yeah, I want to introduce them to something new, hopefully, and make like a special moment that maybe stays with them, even if not at the front of their mind, just kind of like at the back of their mind. They're like, oh yeah, I do like beer. I do want to try new things in beer. I am open to that. Right. I know that it can work. I know it can be great. Um,
Yeah, when you use the 3 Cs and matching intensity, it makes it easier to come up with something that is likely to succeed and likely to tickle their palate in the way that they're used to or is great. Like when you have these contrasts or complements or the intensities, when you know things are gonna flow well together, you're putting your best foot forward into giving them like their best shot at enjoying it.
right. Right. Yeah. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up.
Yeah. Well, go out there, try some pairings, see what works, see what doesn't work, and I'm pretty sure some things would be surprising. You know, give some things a try, and if they're not great, it's still a learning experience.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Good to see you, man.
Yeah, it was a good chat. If anybody's interested in leveling up their beer smarts, passing the Cicerone exams, head on over to thebeerscholar.com. Got a whole bunch of online courses. Um, we do online, like weekly get-togethers where we basically hang out like this and try beer together with all the students and break them down, come up with evocative descriptors, learn how to do sensory evaluation, talk about pairing, all that fun stuff. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you.